Welcome, everyone. We have invited a group of media leaders to join us in a conversation about the role of media in reporting sexual assault. Over the last year, we have seen a major change in responder attitudes towards sexual assault. Me Too and I Believe You have swept across the world and have impacted not only Hollywood, but also major political and business centers of influence. This tremendous shift in culture is both celebrated and questioned. Some are asking, is the pendulum swinging too far? Are we judging people in the court of the public opinion? Is media playing a new role as arbiters in public opinion? This is a major issue that concerns all of us, and so we're very happy today to welcome here as our guests from the media to help us discuss these issues, Shaylan Skulski, host, Alberta Primetime, CTV2, Rick Castiglione, filmmaker, journalist, and educator, and Monica Zurowski, deputy editor from the Calgary Herald. For centuries, sexual assault has been minimized, justified, or silenced. When we start by believing survivors, we create an environment where it's safe for survivors to tell someone about what's happened to them. And in the process, we help survivors get the help that they need and the information they need to make the important decision about whether or not they want to access the criminal justice system. So believing is a first step, but it's not the only step in responding to sexual assault. And that's why we're framing this conversation around the question, I believe you, now what? Our goal today is to educate and engage the broader public in this important and often misunderstood topic. So let's get started. I'm going to start with my very favorite question, and we'll start with Shaylan. You've done a lot of reporting on the issue of sexual assault, so what are some of the positive changes that you've seen resulting from I Believe You and Me Too?
I think there have been a lot of positive changes as a response to I Believe You and Me Too. I think overarching, the main one is that Me Too and I Believe You, they've really allowed for a tool for people to feel heard, for people to be able to share their stories in a way that they were welcomed in an online community in a lot of ways, but in the community generally, to just not feel ashamed about what had happened to them in any way, to not feel embarrassed and to feel welcome to open up about those things and to feel empowered to talk about it and to talk about why that's not okay. So yeah, I think more than anything, Me Too is a tool. It's allowed survivors to talk about their experiences, to feel heard. As a journalist, I feel like there's a lot of healing, hopefully, in feeling heard. And I hope that the survivors that I've spoken to, who I've been so honored to hear their stories, that they have felt some sort of closure in speaking with me. But I think also Me Too and I Believe You, it's invited a bigger conversation about what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about a sexual assault or sexual misconduct or sexual violence. I think, as you mentioned in your intro, there's been some criticism to these movements as well, and a lot of conversation about nuance in the conversation. And I think it invites a bigger conversation about what it is that we're talking about, and kind of trying to, maybe these issues don't have one clear set definition, but just kind of inviting what it is that we're talking about when we mentioned misconduct, and on the other side of the spectrum, perhaps if we want to label it a spectrum, violence. And I think that, it just invites a bigger conversation about what it is that we are seeing in our community that we want to correct and work towards a future with hopefully no sexual violence or no violence whatsoever towards women.
Rick, what about positive changes that you've seen?
Well, I've been reporting on sexual violence for years. Both as a filmmaker and as a mainstream journalist. And one of the things I've learned when I first started out was that it survives in silence and secrecy. Well, the silence has come off. We're talking about it. Cassie in Calgary years ago started a campaign called Finally People Are Talking. Well, they kind of were. And it grew over the years, but I Believe You in Alberta just blew it wide open, saying, it's okay, we believe you, it's okay to talk. So from my perspective, that's the most positive change, is that people do feel validated, that I've got a story to tell, and I'll be believed if I go and speak to somebody. one of the other big changes that I've seen is that government and police are also listening to this. The Alberta government just provided AASAS and its members with significant increases in the amount of money they have to deal with this because the issue wasn't being dealt with. So the government's listening. And I don't think they do that. If people aren't talking about something, they're not going to be listening to anything. So that's a big change. And I think police, over the years, there's been a lot of frustration dealing with, just talking about it, just actually dealing with the whole issue. And now they're saying, oh, we need to. This is in our community. This is an issue. We need to deal with it. So I don't know how far that one's moved along, but I think just, like Shaylin said, talking about it, being able to actually have a conversation like we're having here about this issue is very positive.
Monica, anything you want to add?
Yeah, removing the stigma, I think, has been key in part of this whole conversation in terms of people feeling free to talk about this, whether it's to organizations such as yours, whether it's to the media, whether it's to each other, whether it's on social media. And I think that's been very important because it's not just a problem that's happening within a household privately. It is a public problem. It is a societal problem. And we need to really make sure a spotlight is shone on that. And I think in the last year and a bit, there has been more of a spotlight shone on it than ever before, and that has been very liberating for some victims, and I think it's been very educational for other people in society who might not have been aware of the severity, the frequency, or any of those things. So there's been much positive work, I think, in the last year and a half since we've heard more and more about Me Too, and I believe you.
For the sexual assault centers in Alberta, there's been an incredibly positive impact, and that is that we've experienced a significant increase in people coming forward. We had a 53% increase in 1 year of new counseling intakes, and that's just good news for everybody because people get the help they need, and we have healthier and safer communities. But more away from the positive side and towards the challenges, people are worried about the accused being tried in the court of public opinion. What do you say to that? Do you think the pendulum has swung too far? Let's start with Rick this time.
I get so tired of hearing that.
Okay.
To be honest with you, reporters do their job. Our job is to go out and tell the truth, find the facts, tell the truth. And we report on people who are charged with murder, who are charged with arson, who are charged with car theft and drug, any number of things. And it's no different. When someone's charged with murder, the media reports it, they report their name, they talk about who they are, they talk about what the charges are, but they do it within the law, within the rules that are set out with our courts on fair reporting. Our job is not to undermine what the courts are going to do, but rather to report to the public, to give them information that they need in their lives to make decisions about how their democratic society is going to operate. So when I report on, or anybody else reports on, someone being charged with sexual assault, it's fair. It needs to be reported. We need to be talking about it. Otherwise, I go back to what I said at the beginning, it survives in silence and secrecy. So if the media doesn't report on this issue, nobody's going to know it's a problem. Fortunately and unfortunately, in many ways, the big name celebrity cases that came up really got all the big mainstream media talking about it. And then, this debate got even louder. Well, they're trying in the court of public opinion. No, they're not. They're reporting on the news, what's happening.
And that is happening in the news media. You're absolutely right. One challenge from when I was a court reporter way back is that there was the mainstream media that reported something fairly and accurately and in accordance with the law. Now, of course, we still do that, whether someone has been charged with, as you said, murder or arson or sexual assault. One of the challenges is social media, where you have many, many voices where people may be trying and accusing and convicting without there being any sort of process. So it is one of the dangers. Now, I think overall the pendulum probably for a long time was too far over here. It's nice to see it swinging this way. I think the pendulum will find that perfect spot of balance. It is tricky though, because for all kinds of criminal charges now, we see a lot of people being convicted of various things in social media.
Shaylin?
But there's a difference there. Sorry, there's a difference there. That social media, we hear a lot about fake news, and that's out there. I mean, there are websites that are set up that have no journalistic credentials at all. They're set up, and they've got they've got an agenda that doesn't have anything to do with journalism. So it becomes almost a consumer issue, Monica, I think, in that consumers need to, when they see something, where's this coming from? Who's saying this? And can I believe it?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Shaylin, do you have
Yeah, I guess I do have a little bit to say on, I guess, the role of social media and whatnot, and I definitely want to touch on that one, just in terms of, I guess I'll just briefly say, I think that those perspectives kind of always existed they always existed in the world. I think social media is just giving us an opportunity to hear them in a way that we've never heard them before, and I guess I might be being overly optimistic, but I'm hoping that by confronting those and being able to hear them on a scale that we've, in platforms that we've never heard before, we can also do a better job at perhaps trying to educate maybe some of those narratives and the myths and the stigmas, and just and trying to reach those audience that otherwise we might not have known existed in the scale that they do. So I'm hopeful that social media, even though there obviously we are seeing people speak out, and again there is the concern about trying people in the court of public opinion, I'm hoping that we can educate them on with good reporting, and hopefully, have a bigger conversation about this and educating the community. But I think further to what Rick initially said, is just, speaking through the lens of journalism, our job is to just report the facts as honestly and as accurately as possible. And a lot of times we have to do that with legal jargon, because that's what we look to as being, the safeguards in which we can tell stories. Sometimes we're lifting words or using words that are a little bit more legalese, taking them from either police press releases or legal decisions, because that's how, I guess, they're playing out in the courts at that time. But yeah, it's just our responsibility to be able to do that accurately, responsibly, and in a way that allows for fair comment on both sides. I would say, just from a personal level, I guess I would add, because I was kind of thinking back to some of the stories that I have had a chance to speak to survivors of sexual assault. And actually, I don't think ever in my reporting have I ever come across somebody who has experienced any kind of sexual violence that they wanted to name the person who they are accusing. Like, that has never been a part of the focus of their story. They wanted to tell their story to educate and to empower and to try to identify what they experienced, but also, to let other people know why these things shouldn't be happening. And so I don't know if there's a narrative out there that perhaps exists that some victims or survivors want to come forward with some kind of, vindication, or to try to get some kind of justice. But that hasn't been my personal experience in my reporting. I've never come across somebody who ever wanted to name the accused. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I think it's important to be able to hear from some of the critics out there, and I know there are a few of them, of these sorts of movements like Me Too and like I Believe You, and I think it's important to hear from them and also to include them in the conversation so that we can, I guess, just have a bigger conversation about how to move forward and educate from here. So I know one of them that I've heard a fair bit from is just reading up on some of Margaret Wente from the Globe and Mail. She's talked a fair bit about Me Too, and talking a little bit about why she believes that it's unfair to men, that it actually, that it suggests that we live in this culture of toxic masculinity that allows violence towards women. And I think it's important to kind of recognize that those sorts of perspectives exist, and kind of understand how we can perhaps mediate the conversation so that all people feel welcome to be part of it, and that men don't feel demonized all the time. But yeah, one of the things that she suggested is that, we're carelessly throwing out terms and calling all things sexual violence, and that actually minimizes what it is that we're talking about. So I guess, again, it kind of goes back to my initial point about what it is, inviting a conversation about what sexual violence, what sexual misconduct is, and just making sure that we are addressing that full culture so that we can be in a place where we're comfortable to call out behaviors and jokes and any kind of actions that aren't appropriate. But yeah, I do think that hearing those types of criticism is important. And when we're talking, I guess, about what's next, I guess just kind of speaking from some of those high profile cases and following some of the media narratives that have followed things like Jian Ghomeshi, and I know there was a lot of outrage earlier this, fall about, his essay in the New York Book Review, and even the editor who decided to publish that took quite a bit of heat. And I guess the kind of conversation that unfolds from that is whether or not someone who is accused of these sorts of things should pay forever. And I read an interesting editorial by Christy Blatchford that kind of suggested at what point can we ever forgive? Is there an opportunity for rehabilitation and second chances? And I don't necessarily know that answer. I don't know how to move forward and kind of what comes next. It can be really complex, especially when you're talking about things within the court of law. But I just thought those were some interesting considerations to include to the conversation.
So given some of the things that you said, Shaylin, about narratives that are out there about what survivors want that may or may not be accurate, do you think that media has a new role to play then? And I'm not talking about social media or fake news, but do they have a new role to play in terms of reporting what is true about the narratives?
It's interesting. It's a similar role on perhaps a new topic, because I think one of the things that all of our media outlets we've worked for over the years is we've seen that it's always a changing, growing, evolving kind of situation. And whether that's, I think back to when I started in the business, many years ago now, and people's attitudes towards the environment were changing greatly. And so there was a role that the media had to play. I recall when I started at the Herald, we had 3 environment reporters at one point, and that was what people were really talking about, and it was a hot button issue. It still is very important. I look at how things have changed when it comes to mental health issues, and the media has an expanded or increased role. And now, of course, this is a very important issue, and I do think the media has a role to play when it comes to the Me Too movement and talking about sexual violence or sexual misconduct. So the role, sometimes the topics can change, but I do think that right now the newness for media is this is an issue that hasn't been reported a lot. It's been touched on previous to 14, 16 months ago. It's certainly been touched on and talked about somewhat, but there is an enhanced sense of importance, and there certainly is the role of the media when the community is saying this is important and we want to talk about it and we want to know more. Yes, a responsible media outlet has an obligation and a privilege to actually tell people about that issue, and in this case we're talking about the Me Too movement.
So what about, Shaylin, media as an arbiter of public opinion? Do you think that's a role that they have to play?
As an arbiter, I certainly think we're an arbiter of information, and I think that as journalists we have to take that responsibility very seriously. And again, just accurately and fairly telling stories to inform the public about the issues that affect them most. Just doing as accurately and as fairly as possible. I don't necessarily, I think that all we can do is report the facts as we know them and allow people to form their own opinions, and doing it in a way that honors, survivors, because I would say that I think it takes a great deal of strength to come forward with that kind of story and to be able to share that. I think it's very empowering and it provides a great opportunity. I know I've been moved, and it's been an amazing experience for me to be able to report on those types of stories. And all that we can really do is try to report them as fairly as and accurately as possible. One thing that I do think is kind of interesting with the social media versus traditional media, and something that I've kind of wrestled with, is the chicken before the egg, or how we're kind of feeding these systems back and forth. Because traditionally, I would think news media, they put out a story of some kind and then social media might react to it. But then now I'm starting to see more and more, it's kind of a volley back and forth. Is like a media will put out an article or a story of some kind. There's a big reaction on social media, and then traditional media is responding to that. So, I think it is really good, and it presents a great opportunity that we're able to hear perspectives on a scale that perhaps we've never had the opportunity to be able to do so before, and reach audiences and hear kind of their thoughts on the way that we are reporting. And I welcome that criticism, so that hopefully we become, a stronger and robust media industry, and do our jobs as responsibly as possible. But yeah, again, I think it's interesting to be able to hear the kinds of feedback that we get from our stories, and engage that public opinion, not in any way that would inform our reporting other than to make it better. But I guess just for example, for every tweet that somebody says that you're reporting a story that's unfairly, fact check and make sure that that actually has some basis, because I know that there's a lot of people slinging a lot of opinions online, and I think Rick Penton mentioned it earlier. There are so many kind of new grassroots types journalists that are reporting things, and again, it makes our role as journalists within companies to just do our jobs with the most professionalism and responsibility. The one thing that I did note that I thought was kind of interesting, though, it was some numbers from the US, but it was a report that was just recently released by the Women's Media Center. I think it was October 2018. And they found that since the proliferation of Me Too. Something that was interesting is they suggested that, or their report suggested that the articles on sexual assault was up over 30% from August, starting back in May 2017 to August 2018. And at about a halfway point through that reporting of looking at some of those articles, they also started noticing that media began to commonly write about other issues that particularly pertain to women. So issues like reproductive health and wage gap disparities and things like that. And so I do think it's kind of a further off comparison, but I think it's interesting that we can start off talking about this very important issue that unfortunately predominantly affects women, but also kind of expand the conversation about some other issues that we can talk about to improve the lives of women and communities overall.
So Rick, in terms of the role of the media, I mean, I'm not a media person, but what role do they have to play in terms of an ethical role in terms of keeping survivors safe, protecting survivors?
Yeah, I don't think that's changed at all, Deb.
Okay.
I think we've always respected our sources and the people we interview, and I think our role has changed very little. It's just the news cycle has pushed this issue right to the top, and it's big, and we're reporting on it, and the audience has an audience and readership have an appetite for learning about it. I would say on this one, one of the roles that has changed is organizations like yours and the other sexual assault centers in Alberta, which I think are real leaders in this country in terms of getting that issue out there in the public view, is being so open and working with the media, being available, helping them to understand what is going, and this here is a good example of that. So educating the media and then working with them to be able to tell their stories. How we tell our stories hasn't changed. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. It's we still tell stories, and we tell it truthfully, and we want to get balance, and we want to provide context, and that hasn't changed at all. We're doing more of it, and I'm glad we are. I've seen the struggle to have a story told about this in the past, but not anymore.
So, with this changing environment, what would you say are some rules, or maybe I should say, what's one piece of advice that you would give to your colleagues in order to report on sexual assault in the best way possible? Shaylin, I'm going to go to you first.
Trying to think. I did actually look to sort of what the emerging practices might be on this. And I looked in, and admittedly mine might be a little bit out of date. It's the 16th edition, but I just checked the Canadian Price Style book for the 16th edition. And it didn't actually have a great deal of information about reporting. I mean, it had a bit of notes about just sensitive cases and overall just naming of complainants in sensitive cases, and obviously in cases of a publication ban where that can't happen. But little is actually written about the treatment of these types of stories outside of that. I think which is a bit unfortunate, and perhaps it needs to be updated. I think there is an emerging conversation that I'm hearing more in the newsroom about referring to subjects in these stories as victims versus survivors. I'm not sure if a hard and fast rule exists on that. I do think it perhaps asking the person in which that you are interviewing is a good place to start on that one. I think the term survivor is perhaps a great deal more empowering than using terms like victim. Luckily, in a lot of the reporting that I've done, they are self-narrated pieces, and so it allows people to tell their story in their own words. So it actually simplifies that for me in a couple of ways. But I guess in terms of advice, I would just tell any colleagues is to approach it as you would any other story. I think, as both Rick and Monica suggested, that our roles don't necessarily change in terms of how we approach these sorts of issues, and just trying to tell them as accurately and honestly, and when appropriate and able, to be able to hear from both sides and just achieve that balance as much as possible.
And we've also always had rules, Monica, you've covered courts more than me, regarding when or if it's ever okay to identify a survivor of sexual abuse, and that hasn't changed. And I think, I used to start my year in journalism classes talking about that. You're going to be starting reporting here very soon, so let's talk about the rules right away. Here's how the court works, here's what our responsibility as journalists are. But even as as an instructor in a university, I would spend time, I would take an entire class and talk about sexual violence. I would talk about what it is, what it means, what the stereotypes are.
Any advice?
One word that I like to think of is the word care. I think it's important that we take care when we are talking to people who are survivors of sexual violence. We want to give them the time that they need to talk about it. Certainly they're choosing whether or not they want to talk to the media about it. We want to make sure we're taking, as you mentioned, Rick, the care to talk to them about what this might mean. Their identity is protected by law. Although it is interesting, there have been sexual assault victims who have gone to the courts to fight for the right to be identified, because that is an important part of some people's process. But really to take time and take care, because this is very treacherous waters, and it's important to ensure that those who want to talk about it feel heard, and feel heard honestly and correctly.
Thank you. And I think you named something really important, and that is choice. The choice to have yourself identified or the choice to remain private. And we know sexual assault is a crime where that choice and control is taken away. So the more opportunities for choice that we can offer to the people who are reporting on it, the better for everybody.
You're asking for advice. If I was to throw one piece of advice to young journalists, that may be watching this or preparing to start their careers, pick up the phone and phone Deb or phone Cassett or phone the Edmonton Sexual Assault Center and say, look, I'm new to this. What can you help me understand this issue? What's the language? What's appropriate? Help me through the process. And as reporters, our job is to go out and find information. Well, what's more basic than that? And it's not hard. You're sitting beside a telephone at your desk, just pick it up and call the local sexual assault center and say, in a report I'm going to be covering this. Can you help me get started with it?
Yeah, and I can say that kind of a request would really be welcomed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There are so many resources out there, and as a young journalist in journalism school, I remember one of our assignments was to go out and cover the Take Back the Night March many years ago, and it was a very enlightening experience when you are surrounded by people who have this type of story, or they know someone who's been affected by this type of story. And I think really immersing yourself with as many experts, survivors, people who want to talk about it is the best way to get an education on these points.
Crown prosecutors are awesome. From the little court reporting I did, you're covering a trial. You go up to a prosecutor and say, look, I don't quite understand what's going on. Can you help me? And they'll sit and talk you through the process. They want the same result that you want, and that's fair and accurate reporting of what's going on there.
Right on. Final words, Shaylin?
I was just going to mention, I guess, further too, I think it was mentioned earlier, but just that importance of including context. And while in writing these articles or in these stories, just making sure that you include something in there that discusses just the overall impact that these sorts of things can have on not only the survivor, but all survivors. Talking about prevention efforts and kind of, I guess, again, with a sense of optimism that there are things that can be done that we in the community can do to try to recognize this sort of behavior. So including that part of the context. And then also, I guess, I always try to, whenever possible, is just include resources for people, because we never know who our viewers are. I apologize for that. Who our viewers are, who are, or readers who are reading these sorts of things, or who are consumers of this, and we don't necessarily know what their circumstances are. So I would just say provide resources of where they can go to find help.
That's a young reporter calling, Shaylin. You better get that. Looking for advice.
Well, thank you very, very much. This has been, I especially really like the advice and the suggestions, because I think they were really, really useful, and very much appreciate your willingness to come and talk about this topic. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.